Hey everybody. So 2.5 years ago, I made a video about Kevin Macleod, the guy who makes all the stock music. In the time since, in between bigger projects, I've made 9 more short-ish videos about usually entirely inconsequential things, and sometimes not. A really old ladder, a weird Transformers toy, a big boat made out of concrete, and that stupid little string of text your browser likes sending to web servers. I've long been of the opinion that the Earth flows over with deeply, profoundly fascinating things, and that the only reason it might not seem so at a glance is that you just might not be looking at it the right way. I've collected 10 short episodes I've done over a not inconsiderable length of time for you to watch right here in the hopes that you might just agree. Along the way, please enjoy a handful of neat bumpers submitted by viewers like you as we explore a series of stories about ordinary things. So, let's kick it. Oh, I just realized I'm not doing the voice. Sorry. One sec.
Hey everybody. So finding music for a YouTube video is hard. Harder than you'd think. Want to use that electronic track you've been listening to for years? Sorry, that's owned by some record label you've never heard of and it's not going to be available till 2085. Want to use some background music you heard in your favorite YouTuber's latest video? Sure, as long as you're willing to pay $25 a month for a stock music subscription. Want to add some tracks from the OST of a game that came out 30 years ago? That's about a 50-50 depending on how the game publisher's feeling on that particular day. Finding music that won't get your video obliterated or demonetized is more trial and error than anything else, and you never quite know what's going to set off YouTube's detecting systems, and it's not like YouTube themselves make that very easy. But if you've been around the block more than a few times, it's almost a guarantee that you've heard of a site that comes with no such strings attached. Actual royalty-free music for any occasion, which is a lot harder to come by than you'd think. I'm talking, of course, about Kevin Macleod's Incompetech. Welcome back to a brand new season of Caribbean Mini Episodes, the series where I take a look at anything and everything that makes the world a more interesting place. Granted, this year may have already started, but it's not too late to set it off with a bang as we take a journey through the trials and tribulations of Kevin Macleod, the king of royalty free. Let's get started. As a preface, we gotta talk about the copyright system. The word copyright, along with copyright claimed, copyright infringement, fair use, DMCA, 1978 Act, and so on, well, they get tossed around a lot without a lot of background. So I'll give you guys a quick and dirty primer so we're all on the same page. In the United States, copyright law exists, essentially, to protect the creative work of an individual. If I make a movie and copyright it, and some random dude grabs it and tries to tell everybody they made it, I have the authority to say, no you didn't, get out of my house, and be legally in the right. It's a pretty good idea and concept, but once large corporate copyright holders get involved, things start to get rough. To put it simply, copyright protection, well, it just keeps getting longer. Starting at around 14 to 28 years at their inception in the 18th century, copyright periods and protections have been expanded and modified in 1831, 1909, 1976, and 1998 to their current state today, which provides protection lasting anywhere from 70 to 150 years, which I probably don't have to tell you is a lot. Much of this has been due to lobbying by publishers and copyright holder groups, and it's unclear if it'll happen anytime in the near future, but this is the state of things at the moment. Personal computers and the internet sort of threw a wrench into everything. Millions of creators suddenly gaining the ability to easily create their own content and spread it rapidly meant that determining if something infringed on an existing copyright was going to be a much harder job. Sites had to introduce policies that ensured copyright material couldn't be spread through their services, and this gave rise to the copyright claiming systems we all know and definitely don't love. This posed a particular problem for video makers who wanted background music in their videos. Not everyone wants to try their hand at composing their own original soundtracks, and I can tell you from personal experience that even if you do, it's not exactly the most expedient way to do things. The solution? royalty-free music. If a piece of music is registered under copyright, but its author gives specific permissions that allow it to be used, content creators can make use of it any way they want, as long as they abide by the terms of the composer. It's not public domain, but it's enough to provide independent creators with the supplies they need to create. And for this supply, since the dawn of the internet, there has been great demand. Enter Kevin MacLeod. MacLeod was born September 1972 in the city of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he would go on to study music education at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Throughout the 90s, MacLeod lived a relatively inconspicuous life, playing music for a wedding band and continuing his studies. He would take a position as a sysadmin working at Wisconsin-based Marathon Communications soon after. But in March 1996, he would first make his presence known online with the creation of a small independent site at the address incompetech.com. The site, at its inception, featured a wide variety of features and information very characteristic of personal sites at the time. In early versions, name databases, encyclopedias of British authors, e-cards, and more graced the front page of the site with very little rhyme or reason. MacLeod described the site as a place for him to try out things he was interested in. The name database and his graph paper collection were apparently early hits. But in May of 2000, Incompetech would see a minor update that added an unassuming new feature to the site header. Free MP3s. Using the relatively new MPEG-3 format, Kevin was uploading a series of short original compositions, mostly on piano, along with loops, guitar riffs, and more that were, as the site proudly declared, completely free to use. He noted that, at the time, providing free music was virtually unheard of. What little services that existed almost exclusively offered paid licenses, and although there wasn't yet a good web framework for free music licensing, MacLeod had decided to take his chances and begin uploading music that was for everyone, forever. He released the tracks under his own license, which stipulated users could use the music in any way they pleased, as long as proper attribution was provided. A few select tracks from this era are actually still available on Incompetech today, like 1998's Sovereign. But this was just the beginning. January of 2001 saw an interesting development take place. A small group of American academics, with the support of the Center for Public Domain, founded a nonprofit dedicated to creating and maintaining a series of licenses and standards for media creators in the bold new digital age, to release content that was simultaneously their own, but also was free to use by anyone who abided by some simple guidelines. Creative Commons was established with the goal of providing an alternative to public domain and standard copyright, giving artists a unique license which allowed their work to be distributed, repurposed, and reused in a variety of ways, all depending on the artist's wishes. And this was exactly what Kevin MacLeod had been waiting for. He quickly adopted the standard, using the CC by attribution license, as it most closely resembled what he had been doing independently. MacLeod hoped the CC standard would help users better understand the system, and continue to make music throughout the rest of the early 2000s under this license. Access to assets, MacLeod would later say, is how we make the world better. And his work reflected this, emphasizing quick and easy access to music to accelerate the work of independent creators. The site broke the 100,000 visitor mark in March 2003, and by 2005, MacLeod's music, along with his graph paper, had begun to take front seat on the homepage of Incompetech. Throughout the early 2000s, his music began to take on more complex characteristics, evolving from simple loops around the turn of the millennium to electronica, silent film scores, jazz, and far more. And it was around this time that an entirely new world of content creation would begin to explode, and it would need music just as much as everyone else, if not more. In February of 2005, 3 former PayPal employees joined together to form a small-scale video streaming startup, tentatively called YouTube, a site where users were strongly encouraged to broadcast themselves. A site like YouTube hadn't really been seen before, at least not in a form that was easily accessible to internet users. It's easy to take something like YouTube for granted since, according to my analytics, the majority of people watching right now, me included, haven't really been alive long enough to experience their formative years without it. But it's important not to understate how much YouTube changed independent video production. What was before done largely on a case-by-case basis, with users creating videos on their own and either sharing it person to person or uploading it on their own personal site, now had a centralized hub that not only made uploading your content easy, it made it fun. Long story short, people were making videos, and they were making them quick and cheap. Music, on the whole, is not quick and cheap. But as we've discussed before, there are exceptions. YouTube was where the music of Incompetech would truly take off. While early YouTube might have been a little lax in regards to music copyrights, it quickly clamped down on potential offenses, leading YouTubers to search for places they could quickly find music that wouldn't get their machinimas, let's plays, and skits taken down. And a good bit of the time, Incompetech was that place. Bit by bit, the music of Kevin MacLeod crept its way into the DNA of the independent YouTube video. While initially confined to the realms of short skits and occasionally machinimas, these tracks would eventually end up in a lot of places you wouldn't expect. Tracks from Incompetech can be found in videos as old as 2006, if not earlier, and the more they spread, the more they became synonymous with video production. Where YouTube creators went, the site's music would follow. MacLeod himself would create a YouTube channel in 2007, where he'd post informal release videos for new tracks uploaded to the site. And as the first decade of the new millennium crept on, more and more YouTube users would use, abuse, and bear witness to these royalty-free touchstones, whether they were aware of them or not. Users who were online during their formative years often remember these pieces as the music of their childhood, featuring prominently in the content of pretty much every YouTuber if you looked hard enough. Many Kevin MacLeod tracks would even become ingrained in the individual branding of a YouTuber. Minecraft Redstone and Command engineer Sethbling, along with Yogscast member Nilsi, famously used Cypher as an intro and outro track respectively. Countless trolling channels made heavy use of songs like Scheming Weasel, and horror countdown YouTubers like Chills played the hell out of tracks like Ice Demon in just about every video they ever published. And this continued for over a decade and a half. At this point, Incompetech music has become so ingrained in the collective consciousness of anyone who's ever seen a YouTube video that I can safely say if you're watching this video right now, you've heard at least one, even if you didn't know it. It's just that ubiquitous. It eventually got to a point that individual tracks became identifiable and even infamous, which becomes all the more impressive when you realize that we're talking about short, instrumental, royalty-free pieces that had always just been meant to accompany whatever they were needed for. Even if you don't recognize the names Sneaky Snitch or Monkeys Spinning Monkeys, look them up and give them a listen and you'll know what I'm talking about. Any new YouTuber deciding to make videos for the first time will almost certainly be aware of the site and its resources. It's sort of become the go-to for anyone who wants quick access to video music. When I first started making content, it was certainly my go-to, and it featured prominently in the 25-minute unedited Minecraft PvP video that constituted one of my first official uploads back around 2015. You won't find this, by the way. I've completely obliterated it from the internet. And I continue to use the site. Although I've branched out quite a lot musically and even make a lot of my own, Incompetech is still one of my go-tos for music sources. In fact, you're listening to music from the site right now, and you have been for this entire video. In 2016, MacLeod made all of his music available in YouTube's built-in music library, making it even easier to load up some royalty-free tunes and get a video rolling. It's genuinely difficult to think of any single individual who's had as much of an impact on the landscape of YouTube and internet content creation as a whole as Kevin MacLeod. He helped build the soundtrack for the youth of an entire generation, even if he had no idea it would become such when he first started out. MacLeod's music has, of course, had major success in places other than the internet as well. Video games, independent films both good and bad, NASA's space station broadcasts, public events, school projects, so on and so forth. He has close to 5,000 independent IMDb credits, and that's just those projects that have actually bothered to have an IMDb page. As sounds on TikTok, his tracks have accumulated literal hundreds of billions of listens in just a few short years. I'm not kidding when I say that it's believed believed Kevin MacLeod has become one of the most listened to artists in human history in just the past 2 decades. And it's not due to huge advertising budgets or unique marketing campaigns, just a single individual making music that's for everybody. No strings attached. And it's made so much more interesting by the fact that he had only really set out, in the beginning, to try out a few things on an independent website. Kevin MacLeod continues uploading to Incompetech to this day, with his most recent track being released just a few months ago at the time of this writing. And in doing so, he continues to perpetuate the internet's creative ecosystem in his own unique way. The nature of truly royalty-free music is inherently suited to the interconnected nature of the internet. It's meant to be shared, to be reused and redone. It's about the joy of creation, not the potential profits you can reap from it. And although it may not be the most commonly accepted form of creation, sometimes that's just what you need. Before we get out of here, I'd like to give a special thanks to Kevin MacLeod himself for agreeing to answer a few questions of mine. It was super useful in the production and research of this video. I did tell you where you can find him, but considering you've watched this video, I'm guessing you already know. Hey everybody. So last episode I talked about the music of Kevin MacLeod and how it's become a staple of internet culture in the past 20 or so years. But while we're on that topic, why don't I talk about something that's been around on the internet for even longer and has been used by pretty much every internet user to ever exist, even if most of them don't know about it. What do I mean? Well, your web browser sends a lot of info to whatever page you happen to be visiting on the internet, and a good portion of it is stuff you'd probably never even know about unless you were looking for it. To do basically anything on the internet, your browser has to send an HTTP request, and this request contains things called headers, which basically tell the web server everything it needs to know about you, your browser, and your activity before your request even gets processed. It's sort of your browser's way of introducing itself to the server. But what if I told you there's something your browser sends to every single website you'll ever visit that's pretty much been a universal phrase sent by virtually every browser for the past 30 years? In this particularly short mini episode to go up as I work on a much longer one, let's talk about that. So what is this mysterious message? Well, it resides in one particular browser header called the user agent string. This string is what the browser uses to tell a server who it is. Much of the information is pretty self-explanatory, but one particular section at the very beginning might catch you off guard. Mozilla 5.0. Some of you may recognize Mozilla as the group behind Firefox and other projects, but this string isn't unique to any of their products. Alongside any Firefox-based browser, it can be found in Chrome, Safari, Opera, Edge, whatever you use. It's going to have this string, no matter how far back you go or what browser you switch to. And to understand this, we have to explain the browser wars. Now, the very first browser to make it big in the very early days of the internet was NCSA's Mosaic. First released in 1993, well, it definitely was a browser, that's for sure. It could browse. But it remained at the top of the food chain primarily just because it didn't really have any competition. That would change in 1994, when a team of developers calling themselves Netscape Communications Corporation released the first version of Netscape Navigator, Mosaic's first real competitor. The following year, Netscape Navigator would beat out Mosaic's market shares and become the new king of browsers. But it too would soon gain a competitor in the form of Microsoft's Internet Explorer. In order to keep ahead of the curve, Netscape would consistently introduce new features that in many ways revolutionized the web. Although almost completely phased out now, one of Netscape's most popular contributions was the concept of web frames, which allowed multiple HTML documents to be rendered onto a page at the same time. But at the time, only Netscape supported it. If a web server tried to respond with a page that contained frames to Mosaic or early versions of Internet Explorer, the browser wouldn't know what to do with it. So they had to improvise. Many popular sites around that time adopted a technique called user agent sniffing. Yes, that's actually what it's called, to determine if the browser could support frames. Simply put, if the server detected that a Netscape browser was accessing their page, it would send back pages with frames, and if the browser was literally anything else, it would send back the old-style version of that page. The way it determined this was very simple. During development, Netscape Navigator had gone by the codename Mozilla, a play on the phrase Mosaic Killer, which eventually became the company mascot and the name of a foundation born from the eventual ashes of Netscape. So, to find out if a Netscape browser was accessing their pages, all web servers had to do was use sniffing to find the substring Mozilla in the browser's user agent. It was quick, simple, straightforward, and it meant that Netscape got frames while Internet Explorer did not. But you see, Microsoft did not like this. Eager to catch up, the company quickly added support for frames to their browser, but this didn't really do anything. Since web pages had already adjusted to only allowing Netscape Navigator to access their full content, they would see Internet Explorer in the user agent header and send back the old web page regardless of whether or not the browser could actually interpret frames. Microsoft could have potentially just waited for sites to adapt to the change, but they didn't have time, so they went with a more straightforward solution. They slapped the words Mozilla compatible into their user agent strings, essentially telling web servers that they weren't Netscape but could still do Netscape things. And that was good enough. Browsers detected Mozilla and sent back frames. But since webmasters never had to change their user agent sniffing protocol, they never did. Sites continued to only send certain features to browsers with Mozilla in their headers. And so every browser developed after this point had to have that feature as well. Eventually, they dropped the compatible part entirely, just opening the string with Mozilla 5.0 and following it with whatever the browser actually was. What was originally just a quick fix eventually became the standard, as the web developed around it, and by the turn of the millennium it was unusual to find a browser that didn't have Mozilla in their headers, despite the fact that Netscape itself had been beaten out by Internet Explorer in the late 90s thanks to it being bundled with Windows, and the Netscape Communications Company would go under just a few years later. But the Mozilla header remained. This actually sorta happened again a few times, like when the Linux-based Conqueror browser gained access to content meant for Mozilla's Gecko rendering engine by shoving the phrase KHTML like Gecko into their user agent header, and when Chrome started just putting a second browser identifier in their user agent string because they wanted Safari-compatible features, along with a few similar incidents. As a result of this, the user agent header, which once simply stated the identity of the browser and operating system, now contains a mountain of random extraneous junk that's mostly just your browser pretending to be other browsers in order to get things that it wasn't originally meant to get. Mozilla 5.0 is, of course, the most universal of these, despite the fact that it's almost meaningless today, since frames and other such features were almost entirely phased out close to 20 years ago. But it remains, alongside a spattering of other equally obtuse user agent substrings, as a sort of living monument to the changes the web has gone through and the undying universal impatience of web developers. Thank you guys for watching. I linked a fun article on this in the description if you want to learn more, and I promise there's a bigger video coming soon. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody. So YouTube has a lot of mysteries, both big and small, and that's honestly to be expected. The site turned 18 this year, and for the entirety of that almost 2-decade period, the site has seen pretty much constant activity from billions of users. It's estimated that watching every YouTube video on the site at the moment, end to end as it were, would take upwards of 17 millennia to accomplish. So it's no wonder that the website hides a few unique little unsolved mysteries. There exist videos that very well may be unconfirmed evidence in criminal inquiries, channels that posted constantly for months or years with no explanation at the time, videos that are impossible to find using the search function, and much, much more. But here's a fun one that you may not have heard of before. Open a new YouTube tab and type in "my edited video." That's it. Pause the video right now and try it out for yourself. Weird, huh? In this very short KRB mini episode, let's take a brief and very unorganized look into this phenomenon. Now, if for some reason you didn't look it up, I'll briefly describe it to you. This strange three-letter phrase, when searched, returns a nearly infinite supply of seemingly random videos with upload dates ranging from the earlier years of the site to as recently as this year. The videos have no consistent theme, and while a small handful have views in the hundreds of thousands, the vast majority haven't even breached the 1K mark. So what's the deal with it? Well, upon first glance, you'd be forgiven for assuming it was a situation similar to WebDriver Torso, where a vast array of very similarly titled videos were generated algorithmically and uploaded by an automated channel. But look again and you'll notice that all these videos are from different channels, and many of them seem to be home videos or original projects. No, the true reasoning behind this trend can actually be found in the description of a small subset of these uploads. I created this video with the YouTube video editor is emblazoned across the description boxes of a solid half of these videos. And through this we can discover that the aforementioned YouTube video editor is to blame for this entire situation. Now, the YouTube video editor is a service released by the site in June of 2010, and essentially it's the absolute last resort for any aspiring editor seeking to edit their content. Don't have Premiere, don't have Vegas, don't have KineMaster or iMovie or Windows Movie Maker? No problem, because you always have this. Now, it just so happens that the YouTube video editor automatically assigns your video a default title if you edit using it and forget to actually set one. And that title, of course, is My Edited Video. So essentially, when you punch in this search term, you're seeing 13 years of YouTube users who, for some reason or another, decided to edit using the YouTube video editor and couldn't be bothered to set a title. But there's an issue here. You see, the YouTube video editor doesn't actually exist anymore. The service was effectively removed September 20th of 2017, replaced with a handful of smaller editor features available throughout the studio. So why are we still seeing my edited videos from after this time period, albeit in diminished quantities? Well, the answer to this is a bit tricky. Take this video, for example, uploaded July 17th of 2023. The description states that it was, in fact, created with the YouTube video editor, despite the fact that said editor ceased to exist 6 years prior. But as we can see from the built-in timestamp in the recording itself, we have a video that was, in fact, recorded in 2013, then either left as a draft or saved as private before being made public over half a decade later. Here's a similar example in Russian with an in-video date of 2014. And as for the other videos with the title that don't follow this pattern, well, some people just seem to enjoy using this phrase, although I really could not tell you why. But honestly, the origins of my edited video are the least interesting part. What's far more fascinating is the sheer breadth of content it covers. The earliest of these videos date back to 2010, the release date of the editor itself, and some of them are genuinely really fascinating to watch. Just scrolling absently on the results page, I was able to find weird commercial and logo edits, a welding tutorial, lots of home videos, this really sick coin trick, and it just keeps going on and on. One weird trend is this unusual abundance of edits consisting primarily of logos and end cards for cartoons, most notably the Klasky Chupo logo used in the early 2000s. As far as I can tell, this originated with the channels Jay Cooley and HandyClock536 in 2015, who made these bizarre, almost YTP-style edits of the Klasky Chupo logo, after which point it seems to have just become some sort of running tradition. I'm genuinely baffled by this one. There's even tutorials for it. It actually appears that in this particular case, the videos being named My Edited Video is less a side effect of any editing software and more just a naming convention. It would seem that if you create an edit of the Klasky Chupo logo, you are obligated to name it My Edited Video, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And this actually explains a solid majority of the videos that use this name, but were created after the YouTube video editor cutoff point. There are even entire channels devoted just to edits of this nature, all with the same name, but that's getting too far down into another rabbit hole that I'm not even going to begin exploring today. Another weird quirk is that a lot of the My Edited videos are just straight up full uploads of movies, many of which are either very old, in different languages, or not currently available on streaming platforms. My personal favorite is this Italian fantasy film from the 60s about Hercules fighting this weird dog man. Besides for this, some of the best ones are home videos or instructional clips, like this guy going off on the accordion or this guy showing off his tractor. I suppose what I find so interesting about this whole scenario is that this one simple search term sort of acts like a cross-section of YouTube's populace of the last 13 years. It's no secret that it's not as easy to succeed on the site as it once was, and this is due in part to the fact that it's just become very difficult to find the more obscure or undiscovered content the site has to offer. Even sites like PetiteTube can only do so much. But thanks to a weird little quirk of YouTube's built-in editor and the oversight of a few scattered users, we can see videos that have been sitting for 2, 5, even 10 years without gaining more than a few hundred views. It's sort of like archaeology, digging up these little preserved artifacts that have otherwise gone completely undiscovered for years. You can get lost for hours just scrolling through the results from this search. And I'd recommend that you do sometime, if you have the time, if only to see what the My Edited Video rabbit hole has to offer. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody. So last episode I talked about the little-known YouTube search term My Edited Video, which returns a variety of obscure videos from many different sources, some of which are quite old. But let's be honest, in the grand scheme of things, these videos, the entirety of YouTube's existence, hell, even the World Wide Web and the internet itself, have so far just been a small temporal blip along the full chronological scale of human history. While our rate of development may have increased substantially in the past few decades, changes have been taking place as far back as we can document history, and nothing truly stays the same for any reasonable length of time. Well, almost nothing. You see, there exists within the holy city of Jerusalem a several hundred-year-old ladder that cannot be moved, and indeed, with a few exceptions, hasn't been moved for almost the entirety of its existence. And the reason for this has its roots in a situation nearly 2,000 years old, which we'll be talking about today. Now, the city of Jerusalem and many of the sites therein are extraordinarily important to virtually every Abrahamic faith in the world, featuring heavily in the religious texts of all Christian, Islamic, and Jewish denominations, and hosting a massive number of religious rites and traditions. But you see, there's a small problem. Nearly everything in the city is contested. There are locations that are significant to multiple different religious orders for multiple different reasons. The Chapel of the Ascension, the Dome of the Rock, and many more such places have significance to many groups, none of whom can agree on who exactly should have ownership. For centuries, this has caused war, infighting, and upheavals both religious and political. The city and its holy sites have been captured and recaptured and destroyed and rebuilt countless times for the past 2 millennia without a peace being reached. But what the hell does any of this have to do with a ladder? Well, I'm getting to that. You see, in the year 1757, after changing hands a number of times, Jerusalem was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and it was during this year that a monumental change would occur. On Holy Week of this year, Ottoman Sultan Osman III would issue a firman, essentially just a royal decree, which in essence declared that several sites within Jerusalem were to remain undisturbed and entirely unchanged unless a consensus could be reached by all groups who laid claim to them. This was reaffirmed close to a century later with 2 more firmans by Sultan Abdul-Majid, received international recognition with the treaties of Paris and Berlin in 1856 and 1878, and was given more formal terms even after the fall of the Ottoman Empire by a post-World War II UN commission. This state of being became colloquially known as the status quo. Although defined inconsistently depending on where you look, it has for the past 300 years effectively put a freeze on changes of ownership and alterations of 9 religious sites within Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And this is where we get to the ladder. Let me draw your attention to the dispute of ownership surrounding the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This almost 2 millennia old structure is said to be built on the site of Golgotha, where Jesus was said to have been crucified, and additionally contains what's believed by many to be the tomb Jesus was buried in post-crucifixion. Understandably, the Roman Catholic, Armenian Apostolic, Greek, Coptic, Ethiopian, and Syriac Orthodox churches all lay claim to the site, and as such, it is subject to the status quo, meaning nothing about it can be altered without permission from all 6. But this also includes things that may not have been part of the church to begin with. It's believed that the ladder first appeared in 1728, alleged to have been set up by a mason doing work on the church. The ladder can be seen in all its glory in this 1728 engraving of the building's facade. It's constructed of Lebanon cedar, around 8 feet tall, and for all intents and purposes, is really nothing out of the ordinary. By 1757, it was, of course, still there, said by some historians to have been used by clergy to get out onto the ledge during nice days. And because it was in place when Osman's firman was issued, the ladder became subject to the status quo as well. No member of any church could move it or alter it in any way without incurring the wrath of all others. This may seem a bit odd, but the general reasoning behind it is that if any one church is given permission to make even a tiny alteration, it could cause the others to make their own changes in retribution, and could eventually spiral into complete anarchy and destroy the status quo entirely. In a weird way, the latter being frozen in place could very well be what keeps the current agreement intact. And so it stayed there. We can actually sort of track the ladder throughout history thanks to a number of sketches and engravings that were made throughout the centuries. Here's an 1842 lithograph showing the ladder, here's a photo of it in 1885, and here's a photo taken within the last few years. Throughout the time it's been here, the ladder has seen over 10 Ottoman sultans come and go, and it's seen the empire itself collapse in the aftermath of the First World War. It's seen Jerusalem be besieged at least 4 separate times, and has seen the city change hands time and time again. The world has drastically changed around it, and during all this time, it's just sat there, entirely untouched. Well, almost untouched. There have been, on occasion, slight violations of the ladder's status. In 1997, an unidentified individual allegedly entered the chapel behind the window the ladder is propped up against, and took it inside, hiding it in order to make a statement about the divisiveness of the current agreement in the city. There does, in fact, exist video proof of this event happening. The ladder was put back in its original spot once found, and grates were installed over the window in order to deter future attempts. But it didn't quite stop here. In 2009, for some unknown reason, the ladder was found to be resting against the left window instead of the right for a very short period, during which some rare, limited-time photos of the moved ladder were captured. But it was of course moved back to its classic resting place promptly, and it remains there to this day. No major disturbances have occurred in the time since. I suppose the reason this is all so interesting is the fact that this ladder, in quite literally any other circumstance, would have been completely and utterly forgotten. Beyond its age, there's nothing about this ladder that really makes it any more significant than something you'd pick up at Home Depot for $60. It was left on the windowsill out of apathy and remained there for years because it was convenient for the clergy, and it remained ordinary until it was suddenly and unexpectedly struck by an event entirely unrelated to itself in the spring of 1757, after which point it inexplicably became so much more important than it had ever been before. Very often, this is just the nature of history. We can't really control what is remembered and what isn't, and the most inconsequential of objects and locations can become infamous and recognizable for reasons entirely out of our control. In 2014, a Winchester lever-action rifle from the late 1800s was found leaning against a remote tree in a national park in Nevada. It had been resting there for over a century, entirely undisturbed, and once found, received national news coverage and secured a spot in a Nevada museum. The rifle's original owner has never been identified, and they certainly had absolutely no idea when they left their rifle leaning against that tree 140 years ago that it would one day become more famous than they would ever be, joining the immovable ladder and countless other ordinary objects from throughout history that, through some stroke of fate, have left an impact far beyond what their original owners could have ever imagined. Thanks for watching.
Oh, is it bedtime, Granny?
Hey everybody. So last episode I talked about the immovable ladder of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which, as the story goes, hasn't been meaningfully moved for close to 300 years. The ladder is a rare example of an artificially created temporal fixed point, a strange little sanctified artifact that, through careful enforcement and care, has managed to avoid falling into ruin as so much of humanity's past endeavors have long since done. We often mourn these losses, and sometimes rightfully so. There are things buried down in the dark, silent foundations of the world that some would give almost anything to see cast in light once more. But this isn't always the case. Every so often, we as a species come up with, and then subsequently forget about, something that may be better off left in the past. And, well, there's really no other way to put this. This is an episode about concrete boats, one of them in particular. So, let's talk about that. The date is April 1917, and the United States has, in a bold and unprecedented move, joined the Great War to render aid to the Allied powers. The declaration of war issued by President Woodrow Wilson had been in part spurred by Germany's engagement in unrestricted and highly aggressive submarine warfare. Said warfare had sunk many hundreds of Allied vessels, and even in these early stages of the country's entry, the United States needed ships. By mid-April, Congress had approved the Wilson administration's request for a greater level of maritime development and established the Emergency Fleet Corporation. The purpose of the corporation was, as you may have guessed, to construct a fleet, not just of warships, but of transport and shipping vessels as well. Metal ships as well as wooden ones were soon under construction all across the nation as part of the brand new emergency fleet, but shipyards soon ran into a spot of difficulty. By April of 1918, a national, and in many ways international, steel shortage had gripped the United States, and desperate to continue production, shipbuilders had to get creative. And creative, in this case, meant concrete ships. Now, as strange as it might sound, this was not the first time the concrete ship concept had come up. Not even close, in fact. All the way back in 1848, a French inventor named Joseph-Louis Lambeau created a construction material he referred to as ferro-cement, a system of metal reinforcement mesh or bars wrapped in hardened concrete. Lambeau decided, for whatever reason, to demonstrate his invention through the creation of a ferro-cement dinghy that did indeed float. Throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th, concrete boats of varying shapes and sizes were constructed and put to sea to varying degrees of success. In almost all cases, they were built simply as a cheaper and more abundantly sourced alternative to traditional wooden and ironclad vessels. Earlier in 1917, a Norwegian shipbuilder named Nicolai Fugner had obtained permits for, and rapidly afterwards constructed, two massive self-propelled concrete cargo vessels. The Royal Navy had begun launching their so-called Crete fleet that same year, with a planned final size of over 150 concrete transports. So really, the idea wasn't as far-fetched as it might seem today. The initial plan by the Emergency Fleet Corporation was to construct 43 vessels, but due to a variety of extenuating circumstances, the largest of which being that the war had in fact ended a month prior, the plan was quickly scrapped as soon as the first ships began to be launched in early December of 1918. Only 12 of the original 43 were constructed, none of which would ever actually see the conflict they had been built for, and the first and certainly most well-known of the dozen was the SS Atlantus. She measured around 250 feet in length and had a deadweight capacity of 3,000 tons, slightly lower than her metal contemporaries thanks to her heavy construction, and was officially launched and christened on December 4th. But as she was launched several weeks after the conclusion of the conflict that had necessitated her construction, a new purpose for the Atlantis would need to be found.
A new system of engines were installed aboard the Atlantis throughout 1919 as she was tested for seaworthiness, and with a maximum speed of around 10 knots, she was soon sold to a series of northeastern shipping companies that put her to work transporting coal. Beginning in late 1919, the Atlantis could be seen running the length of the east coast of the United States on a long series of coal shipping operations, which would start to wind down in the early years of the next decade. The ship's unusually low deadweight capacity and unusually high operating costs had led to her being considered unprofitable by the shipping companies that operated her, and in 1925 she changed hands yet again, being bought by H.P. Etheridge Inc. in Virginia for a staggeringly low $3,025, around $54,000 in today's money. There, the ship was stripped of all its valuable or reusable components, reduced to the concrete shell it had begun as. But this was not the end of her story. In June of 1926, the empty hull of the Atlantis was purchased by Baltimore-based Colonel Jesse Rosenfield to be towed over to Cape May, New Jersey. She would not be serving as a ship, but instead a pier. The Atlantis and a handful of her contemporary concrete vessels were to be arranged to form a ferry pier for a planned route from Cape May to Lewis, Delaware. But following a pattern that was becoming increasingly apparent, all did not go according to plan. On July 13th of 1926, a fierce storm at Cape May broke the Atlantis out of her moorings and blew her aground a few hundred feet from the shore of Sunset Beach. Over the following weeks and months, Rosenfield and Company would attempt numerous times to free the cargo ship turned pier from her grounded fate, but none of these were successful, and the group would eventually abandon the area when the ferry route initiative went under. For around a decade after this point, the Atlantis remained grounded in what would become its final resting place. While unusual, the ship was not an unwelcome sight for the residents and visitors of Cape May, and she would become a strange sort of tourist attraction and curiosity, appearing on postcards and being photographed on numerous occasions. Only two further changes would occur regarding the status of the Atlantis. In 1937, after around 11 years in one piece, her hull ripped open and the ship noticeably began to droop. Decades later, in 1961, this rip evolved into a full-scale breakage, and the entire stern half of the Atlantis slipped beneath the waves of Cape May. And this is the state the ship has remained in since, ever so slowly degrading and sinking back into the earth from which her constituent parts were pulled. She remains a prominent fixture and sightseeing attraction for the town, and continues to be promoted on tourism sites and brochures as a sort of living monument to her own destruction. She's been designated a New Jersey historic site, and will remain as such until she fades entirely from view. But despite what one might think, the Atlantis is not the last of her kind. Many more ferro-cement vessels were constructed in her day, and many still remain in working order. A 1918 concrete barge rests on the edge of Seattle's Lake Union, serving as a floating outdoor dining area for Ivar's Salmon House. A 1921 concrete riverboat that's seen many lives come and go now operates as a floating marine supply store in Florida, known simply as The Boat. And many world-weary but still intact members of the original British Crete fleet rest in harbors and docks all across the United Kingdom. The Atlantis and her sister ships now fit within the same cultural niche as things like long-distance telephone exchanges, iron lungs, and slide rules, things that very much did exist and that at the time served a vital purpose, but that now simply exist as reminders of the world they once belonged to. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. They help us understand how exactly it was that we got to where we are today. And as long as we continue to remember, as long as the bow of the Atlantis continues to jut from the Cape May surf, we will be made all the better for it. And with that, thanks for watching. Hey everybody. So last episode we talked about the SS Atlantis, a concrete steamship that ended her long and arduous existence at the bottom of the Cape May Inlet in the 1920s. The Atlantis and its sister ships may not have been huge hits in their own time, but with the steady march of years has come that very particular brand of notoriety and value that's born only from extreme rarity and age. The venerable, the alarmingly scarce, and the exceptionally unusual just seem to fascinate us.
In short, if something's old, rare, weird, or some combination of the three, you can damn well bet somebody's going to be real interested in it. For me, at least, toy collecting has always been one of the most fascinating manifestations of this, and a truly bizarre story from the annals of the hobby has somewhat recently been brought to my attention by a helpful viewer. A tale involving blurry photos, lines of 80s children's merchandise, and the country of Finland. Let's talk about black tracks. This is a story about Transformers, but even bearing that in mind, the story, while not impenetrable, is a little hard to get into if you don't understand the context in which it took place. So, in preparation, here is a brief summary of the events that allowed this saga to unfold. Now, as many of you may know, Transformers was, and still in a sense is, a media franchise created in the mid-1980s primarily to sell toys to children. This is not in any way a new or unique phenomenon, especially for the 80s. The decade saw Mattel's Masters of the Universe with accompanying action figures that mostly look like characters from the show, Hasbro's original run My Little Pony with its affiliated line of very sad-looking horses, even the Care Bears, who are owned by a greeting card company, if you didn't know. But Transformers is fairly unique amongst its brethren thanks to the fact that, technically, the toy line predates the franchise by several years. In 1974, Japanese toy company Takara began manufacturing a line of action figures titled Microman, based on molds originally designed for Japanese distribution of G.I. Joe. The storyline for the products would eventually come to state that the Micromen were alien warriors from a tiny version of Earth who were actually just that small, and were disguising themselves as action figures while visiting our planet. With its experimental aesthetic and penchant for swappable parts, Microman was a hit in Japan, and would continue to be so throughout the 70s. So much so that in 1980, the line would inspire a more complex series of figures known as Diaclone. The gimmick of the series was robots, piloted of course by tiny plastic humans that could transform into all manner of futuristic vehicles and machines, then turn right back into their robot forms with a little finagling. Around 1982, Takara introduced the appropriately named Car Robots subline for Diaclone, foregoing the trite spaceships and giant insects for the infinitely more thrilling Lamborghini Countach and Toyota Hilux N40. See where this is going? Despite its success, Diaclone was very much a national brand, seeing very little popularity when released in Europe and even less in North America. That was until 1983, when representatives from Hasbro Industries encountered a set of Diaclone toys at the Tokyo Toy Show, and signed a deal with Takara that would go on to define a generation. While Diaclone continued production in Japan, Hasbro took over production in the US and began manufacturing under the powerful new Transformers name. Almost every first-gen Transformers toy was an almost exact reproduction of an earlier Diaclone one, albeit with modified branding. A tie-in TV show was birthed in 1984, and the rest was history. Now, what does this all have to do with collecting? Well, in the current market, 1984 Transformers releases can sell for upwards of $1,000. And remember, Takara's pre-Transformers Diaclones were basically unheard of outside Japan, so for any American collector, a Diaclone predecessor to a later Transformers toy is going to be rarer and therefore worth even more. A Diaclone Datsun Turbo car robot, for example, will go for significantly more than a Transformers Generation 1 Blue Streak, despite them basically being the same toy with color variations. But even more highly sought after are the subset of Diaclones shipped off to Europe in the early 1980s, representing a very brief period after the beginning of the line, but before the Transformers deal. These were often shipped with exclusive branding or localized names and are considered exceedingly rare. Hell, some of them even went essentially unknown for decades until being discovered in the 2000s. Whenever a new one pops up, there's traditionally a scramble amongst collectors to be the first to get their hands on it. And with that, enter Fumihiko Akiyama. Akiyama is, or was, I genuinely do not know if this man yet lives, a pillar of the early 2000s Transformers hobbyist community. A self-published franchise virtuoso, Akiyama wrote several seminal works of Transformers reference material, was said to have worked directly with Takara, and most significantly, possessed one of the most extensive Diaclone collections known to exist. Rare variants, limited time products, promotional vehicles, you name it, and this guy probably had it. And it's with this collection that the mystery truly begins. Following the conclusion of BotCon 2000 in Japan, a convention Akiyama had organized that is exactly what it sounds like, he published this blurry photo featuring a portion of his collection. Now, there's something strange about this photo. Can you spot it? Chances are, if you're not an active Transformers collector, you probably can't. It's this. Second row from the top, third from the right. A black Corvette Stingray. Any Transformers collector worth their salt recognized the model, the car form of the 1985 Generation 1 Transformers toy known as Trax, coveted on its own thanks to its age and rarity, and of course inheriting from an even more valuable Diaclone model, which this specific car most likely was. But that wasn't the problem. It was the color. Hobbyists scoured their old catalogs, scrubbed through online databases, and turned their own collections upside down, but the facts were clear. Neither Hasbro nor Takara had ever manufactured a black Trax, at least not as far as anyone could tell. The model had only ever been offered in red or blue, no matter the manufacturer or locale, and with this in mind, hobbyists immediately got to speculating. Was it real? Fake? A factory defect? Some one-off promo item that was never advertised? Questions began to fly, and Akiyama, for his part, wasn't particularly helpful. All the collector would say was that he had purchased the toy at a UK convention in the late 90s, and that, strangely, it was not a Diaclone, dismissing claims that it was a European exclusive manufactured by Italian company GIG. This conflicted somewhat with a retrospective recently published in Japanese toy magazine Gangu Jinsei, featuring what appeared to be the same toy, describing it as not released in Japan, but still listing it alongside other rare Diaclone models. And thus theorizing continued unabated. This could be one of the most fascinating collector finds of the entire decade, if only anyone could figure out what the hell it actually was. And this theorizing would go on to little effect for around 4 years. Akiyama's black Trax remained the only known instance to exist, if it even was a distinct model of its own, and no information on the toy could be found. More confusion was added to the pile when, in 2002, Takara released an extremely limited run of the original Trax mold in black as part of a magazine sweepstakes. But then, in June of 2004, something strange happened. A seller reached out to an online Transformers dealer named Morgan Evans, claiming to be in possession of a Diaclone black Trax that he'd owned since childhood. This seller was not from Japan or the United States, nor was he from Italy or even the UK, where Akiyama claimed to have obtained his copy. The seller, along with this now second known to exist toy, originated in Finland.
I want to reiterate that the toy did not end up in Finland. It was born there. The seller claimed that he had received the toy as a child in the 80s and had grown up with it before deciding to sell it in adulthood. This didn't make a huge amount of sense to collectors, considering that, as mentioned before, Diaclones were sold almost exclusively in Japan, with small enclaves in Southern Europe and North America. But then things started to click into place. You see, earlier that year, a mysterious instance of a Diaclone grapple truck had surfaced in Japan and caused a fair bit of confusion. The mold was undoubtedly an original Japanese one, but the box resembled the Italian GIG localized packaging, and some choice text on the box was in what else but Finnish. Upon rediscovering this info, hobbyists re-examined the vendors in attendance at the 1998 BotCon, around the time Akiyama claimed to have come across his artifact, and discovered that one amongst the legions of sellers had been a Finnish toy dealer.
By 2005, once a 30-second 1984 Finnish TV ad had been discovered, and another Black Tracks, this time with box, had emerged from the ether of obscurity, a semi-conclusive answer was pinned down. In the early to mid-80s, a Finnish convenience store chain called R-Kioski, which maintains bastions in Estonia and Lithuania, somehow struck a deal with Takara to distribute a hyper-limited line of Diaclones within their store walls. The fact that this deal and the promotion it enabled even existed was almost entirely unknown, both at its inception and in the decades following, but Takara very much did manufacture a small collection of specialty Diaclones to be sent to Finland and stocked on R-Kioski shelves for a short period in 1984. This made the R-Kioski Diaclones, Black Tracks obviously included, not just a regional exclusive or even a country exclusive, but a store exclusive, likely giving rise to the frightening scarcity of the toy in years to come. Now, in the years since, the rarity of the toy has decreased slightly. At last count, an additional 10 have been unburied since 2005, and moreover, it's not even the most rare of the R-Kioski exclusives to be discovered. A really unintentionally funny pamphlet written in both English and Finnish, which came packaged with Black Tracks, mentions a handful of its sibling vehicles, many of which have quite literally not been found in 20 years of searching. These days, a Generation 1 1985 Transformers Tracks in good condition will sell for over $1,000. A Diaclone Tracks will likely sell for more, and a Finnish Black Tracks, well, it's not like anyone in possession of one would be overeager to see it sold in the first place. The toy is so sought after that in recent-ish years, people have even tried to counterfeit it. In 2012, a seller attempted to pawn off a fake Black Tracks at a BotCon event for close to $3,000. Thankfully, it went unpurchased and was quickly identified as a counterfeit by diligent observers, which is great because I honestly cannot imagine the shame of getting conned out of a month's salary by a fake Transformer. And with that, the mystery of Black Tracks was tentatively solved. A Finnish convenience store exclusive built by a pre-Transformers Japanese toy company that the entire world collectively forgot about until a single hobbyist uploaded a photo of his collection. If the photo had never been published, it's entirely likely that Akiyama's Black Tracks would still be the only one in collector hands. A piece of an admittedly very strange and shockingly obscure history, but a piece of history nonetheless. Despite its uncountable flaws, I really do quite like the world we live in my own way, and it's little things like this that really remind me of why. And with that, thanks for watching.
Oh, hey. I didn't see you there. What the fuck was that? This is a plug, but it's a plug for this channel, not like a sponsored segment. I don't really get those. I'll try not to take an insane amount of time, but in the case that you do want to skip, there's a timestamp. It'll be somewhere on the screen right now. I haven't decided yet. And you can just skip ahead to that point in time. I won't be offended at all. Okay, if you're still here, thank you very much. I appreciate you sticking around. I'll try not to bore you too much. I kind of just want to talk about supporting the channel. And what do I mean by that? Well, this may or may not be a well-known fact, but I actually don't do YouTube for a living. At the present moment, I work at a deli. You know, I unload boxes, I make food for people, and so on and so forth. And with the exception of like a really brief period in fall of 2013, I think, I've never made a living off YouTube. It's never been my thing. I've always just worked a series of odd jobs. Now, obviously, I'm, just graduated college. I'm looking for a new career. Job market's shit. You've probably heard it all before. But the point remains that I do basically make more money, like unboxing meat and bread than I do making YouTube videos, basically any day of the week. Now, why is this a problem? Well, honestly, it isn't. But what it is kind of an impediment for the kind of videos that I really want to be making on this channel. I want to make videos that are longer, that are more in depth, maybe that are like in multiple parts. But unfortunately, that takes money, that takes resources, and most importantly, that takes time which I just don't really have because, you know, I work a part-time job. I can't be making YouTube videos 24/7. I have a lot of major videos that I've canceled because I just can't really accommodate them in my current schedule. I have this feature-length video about the Bell system that would involve, you know, like renting camera equipment and going out on location and doing interviews and shit like that. And I really want to make that video. I've wanted to make it for years at this point, but I can't afford that on the salary that I get working at the deli. And even if I was able to afford it, I would just have to show up at work at 8 a.m. the next morning anyway, so it would be kind of pointless. I know everyone wants to make money, you know, just fucking around making YouTube videos on the internet. And I know you've probably heard this request a million times before, but very often it does come from what I think is a pretty genuine place. And the request is for you guys to, if you would like, support the channel. The proposition being that if you do, it will make it easier for me to make longer videos, for me to make more videos, and for me to make videos that are more in line with my vision for how I want to make videos, you know, all the time. How can you do this? Well, there are two major ways, essentially. The first way is that you can support me on Patreon. This is obviously much more straightforward, and it's obviously very direct. I have tiers in the Patreon ranging from $1 to $10. If you do it, you sometimes get your name at the ends of videos, you know, you get access to scripts before they get made into videos, you get access to, you know, various behind the scenes shit. It's fun, and you directly support the channel. Every dollar I get on the Patreon works its way towards, you know, being able to make videos the way that I really want to be making videos. The second way is more indirect, and it's something I feel like I don't really see people talk about too much, and that's sharing the video. I feel like quite often when I find, you know, a new YouTuber or a new kind of video that I now like watching, it's been because I've seen someone on Discord or on YouTube, you know, mention it or talk about it in passing, and I've looked it up and found it really interesting. So if you don't want to support on the Patreon but you still want to see the channel grow, feel free to just, you know, take this video or take a video that you think is particularly good and share it with someone who you think might like it. You never know, maybe they'll like it. It's also possible that they'll hate it, but hopefully that's not the case. Doing either of these things or some secret third thing that I leave you guys to come up with yourself are all incredible ways of supporting the channel, and I will be exceptionally thankful to you if that's what you end up doing. Obviously, at the end of the day, you don't have to listen to me. I'm some, you know, schmuck who makes edutainment videos on YouTube. But I really would appreciate it, and if you want to see, you know, the channel develop more, as I've been trying to develop it for the past 5 or so years, this would be an exceptional way to speed that process along. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to me ramble, and back to the stuff you actually came here for. Have a wonderful night, everybody, and so continue season 2.
Hey everybody. So last episode we talked about an obscure proto-transformer toy made in Finland in the 1980s in very limited number. Since this time, Transformers, as a franchise, is one which has valiantly fought its way through the miasma of decades and emerged relatively intact in our modern era. But you know who hasn't? Blockbuster Video. What was once a universal, national cultural touchstone is now not so universal, and many of the company's lesser-known endeavors throughout its lifespan have, in the present day, been completely forgotten. Case in point, did you know that for a brief period in the mid-90s you could visit and enjoy an adult-only Blockbuster party building? Well, you're gonna. Now, to understand what I'm about to tell you, we of course need to know a tiny bit about what exactly Blockbuster was. I've actually weirdly done a video on this whole thing, so check that out if you're particularly curious, but for everybody else, here's the extremely abridged version. 1985, a Texas entrepreneur named David Cook, fresh off selling software infrastructure during the 1980 Texas oil boom, starts a video store in Dallas. Blockbuster Video takes off basically on day one thanks to their implementation of such novel practices as as letting you bring the tape to the counter and not having the tape cost $150. Cook starts to franchise gets bought out by frightening 80s businessman and garbage truck czar Wayne Huizenga in 1987, and rapidly begins to explode in both scale and popularity. In the early 90s, the company hits its 20th century peak with thousands of stores in multiple countries, a sprawling video library, and a recent acquirement by media mega conglomerate Viacom in 1994. And it's during this halcyon period that our story takes place. Sure, there are tribulations, big ones, to come in the preceding years, but for now, Blockbuster is flush with money, globally recognized, and is backed by the guys who own MTV. So what does one get for the company that very briefly has everything? Apparently, an indoor amusement park complex. A big one. Word first began to circulate mid-1994. Information was, of course, tight, but it was rumored that Blockbuster was planning a highly experimental, quote-unquote, entertainment center concept to be trialed in approximately 4 cities across the nation, the only known at the time being Indianapolis, Indiana. By November, plans had solidified and become a public matter. Blockbuster Entertainment, as it was now called under Viacom, would be building 2 quote-unquote indoor entertainment complexes, downsized from the original 4, in 2 mid-sized American cities, with an Albuquerque, New Mexico location being revealed to complete the duo under the admittedly really fun name Blockbuster Block Party. The concept had first been fielded by Bill Burns and Fred Brooks, former Walt Disney Company thralls and present operators of Blockbuster's Entertainment Center division, who proposed the plan based on an understanding that while theme parks couldn't survive off modestly sized cities like Albuquerque and Indianapolis, a smaller complex could fit the niche perfectly. Each site would be developed by theme park veterans ITEC Entertainment and cost $5 to $8 million. They'd be aimed at the supposedly elusive 18 to 45-year-old market and feature an extensive collection of sensory experiences that customers could, in theory, return to experience again and again. Now, don't let words like entertainment center fool you. This was a showbiz pizza. Indoor amusement park with food, arcades, video experiences, little plastic cards that you could put money on. The only thing missing was the Rock-afire explosion. But remarkably unique for the era, and unlike mixed-age establishments like Dave & Buster's, it was almost entirely adult-oriented. Kids needed adult supervision and special permissions to even enter the premises. If the residents of Albuquerque had ever dreamt of boozing it up in a Chuck E. Cheese ball pit, now was their chance. The New Mexico location was to be the first opened, and construction continued throughout the end of the year as the very first block party complex, fittingly occupying an entire city block, prepared for opening day. And on December 19th of 1994, this day arrived. Upon entering a block party building, guests were welcomed by an atmospherically lit, stylized street scene, which served as a hub location for the facility's many attractions as city sounds and light effects would play on a loop to drive up the effect. Visitors would acclimate themselves to the environment at Infomania, an information desk to their immediate right, where they could receive a fun card loadable with cash to be spent throughout the building. Ahead and to the right, guests could enter the Power Grid, a multi-level playground dark area with vibrant lighting and effects, complete with a suitably big-ass ball pit. Across the street from the Power Grid was Flippers, a sprawling arcade room themed after a giant pinball machine, with all manner of arcade cabinets and electromechanical games. Adjacent to Flippers was a unique and often headlining attraction called Virtua Alley, an early-ish virtual reality station which featured at least one game where customers could kill quote-unquote hulking robots and lizard-like creatures. Back out on the street and to the right of the Power Grid was Super Bloopers. a bizarre sports-themed finger food restaurant which could serve alcohol, and towards the end of the street were two more decidedly low-key entertainment rooms. The Tube was a smaller, rentable party room filled with tables and TVs, and the Go Motion Pictures Theater was the quintessential theme park 4D experience, with motion-controlled seats synced up to a number of action-packed short films, the most popular of which was known simply as Dino Island, all available for just $2.95 on your fun card. Finally, on their way out, guests could stop by Alarm and Stuff, the official gift shop which sold Block Party paraphernalia, and with that, their blockbuster Block Party adventure had concluded for the day. All experiences were paid for through funds placed on the fun card, and on opening week, things seemed to be looking up. I'll be fully honest, if it wasn't for the fact that I was yet to exist for close to a decade when it opened, I'd have taken a trip down to see one of these things myself. After all, as one Albuquerque 18-year-old put it to an LA Times reporter, it's something to do. Here in Albuquerque, if you're 18, there isn't much you can do. And so, it continued. Or did it? After the subsequent opening of the Indianapolis location, and not even a year into the operation of the two complexes, there began to be heard rumblings that they were not long for the world of entertainment. And these rumblings seemed to emanate from our good friends at Viacom, who by the first quarter of 1995 had started to take issue with Blockbuster's side hustles. You see, Block Party wasn't the only weird thing Blockbuster had its hands in at this point in time. Prior to acquisition, the company under Huizenga was essentially throwing shit at the wall with quite minimal stickage. As of spring '95, the company owned Spelling Entertainment, Republic Pictures, a chain of music stores, a merchandising branch, a selection of video games, a PC repair division, and a $1 billion plan for an entire theme park in Florida. And to Viacom, this was nothing more than an itemized list of everything they needed to axe under their new management, with Block Party stamped in bold red at the bottom of the page. It wasn't so much that Block Party was wasting money or failing to return on its investment. Hell, the things hadn't even been running for more than a handful of months. It was that the existence of the complexes embodied something Viacom simply did not envision as part of their stripped-back, low-maintenance blockbuster of the future. And so, just as abruptly as it had been announced, Blockbuster Block Party would begin to detach itself from Blockbuster in the middle of 1995. What exactly happens at this point is unclear and not super well documented. Reports from the time claim Block Party was sold to contemporary entertainment complex Discovery Zone, but at the time Blockbuster owned a majority share in the company, so it's not easy to determine what the intended fate of the parks truly was. What is clear is that Blockbuster was absolved of all direct involvement. By July of 1996 and August of 1997, the Indianapolis and Albuquerque locations, respectively, were still advertising and hiring, respectively, but absent the Blockbuster name, going simply by Block Party. The advertising paper trail slowly deteriorates at this point, and the two locations likely languished in relative obscurity, left to slowly fade away by their parent companies until, in 1999, the Albuquerque location officially closed its hallowed doors. Discovery Zone, which had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1997, had vowed to close a number of so-called underperforming fun centers to regain its solvency, and in the apparent limbo state the Block Party centers had been left in, the location was primed to be cut. Local fun center business operators were reportedly confused by the move. One Albuquerque arcade owner remarked, "It was a very nice facility. I don't know why it didn't succeed." In 2002, the Indianapolis location was shuttered with even less fanfare, with no explanation being given by the group which now owned the establishment. And with this, Blockbuster Block Party, tossed and beaten by the winds and waves of corporate nonsense for close to a decade, finally ceased to exist. But their buildings did not. The fates of these two buildings, abandoned shrines to a forgotten place and time, diverge at this point. Despite being the first to close, the Albuquerque location was looked after for some time. In late 2005, a very similar establishment called It's opened within the original Block Party building, which ran until 2016, when a land ownership dispute put the business underground. It sat again in disuse for 6 more years until 2022, when the vibrant purples and oranges were overwritten with a dull gray, and the building was inhabited by an abstractly pizza-related business called Peter DeFries Corporation, the form it remains in to this day. The Indianapolis location was not so lucky. After its shutdown in 2002, the building was, for all intents and purposes, left to rot for a decade in an empty lakeshore parking lot. Amazingly, this strange period of disrepair was coincidentally captured in striking detail by an Indiana Dance Dance Revolution community forum called IndieDDR, who toured the location in the midst of its closure. I'll link these surreal photos below. Finally, in 2012, the site was bulldozed to make room for a $25 million housing development, which was built upon the ruins and made open to the public in 2013. If one amongst you happens to live in the lakeside building of the Indianapolis 82 Flats apartment development, rejoice, for you are living atop the relics of one of Blockbuster's most unusual legacies. Blockbuster itself went on to experience a late 90s lull, followed by an unexpected second peak in 2004 under a man named John Antioco, before dying a slow and painful death to the 10 million cuts of the information age. But it has still not been forgotten. And let history not forget these things either. Strange and unexpected, but otherwise very charming monuments, temples dedicated to the environment they were born from, which might have otherwise lived fruitful lives, if not left for dead by forces too large for them to contend with. In the world beyond this, where things are which are no longer, I like to imagine that somebody's having a pretty good time in the ball pit. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody. So last episode we talked about Blockbuster's abandoned block party buildings, their near imperceptible span of existence in the midst of a fast-moving decade before being eroded and stripped down to burnt-out labyrinthian husks by the tireless currents of time. Between their abandonment and their destruction/reoccupation, the block party structures could be explored as incidental mazes by those bold enough to venture inside. Now, if, understandably, you want the maze experience without the rotting building elements, you've still got plenty of options, and at the top of my mind presently is the seminal 1982 Atari 2600 title Entombed, which tasks the player with navigating a fast-scrolling warren of corners and crevices whilst being pursued by a little blue entity. Most relevant to the video, however, is the fact that for over 3 decades, nobody could figure out how the game actually worked. So, let's take a crack at it. Where else to start but the beginning? In this case, the vibrant autumn of 1982. Around November of this year, now defunct and wonderfully named publisher US Games releases Entombed for the wildly popular Atari 2600 system. The game is simple. It kind of has to be, and it centers around a scrolling maze which the player must pathfind through while dodging what is ostensibly a zombie. You can pick up an appropriately rectangular item called a make-break to either remove or place a chunk of maze wall to aid you in this endeavor. If you get knocked off the screen, you die. If the zombie touches you, you die. Simple, quick, repeatable. It's a 2600 game. And it remained as such throughout the crash of '83, throughout the rise of the NES, and through the various sundry events leading up to and following the turn of the millennium. In fact, it wasn't until 2018 that someone noticed something was a bit off. The maze in Entombed is impossible, or at least it seemed as such. It continues to appear for minutes at a time, with patterns that are generally navigable, as if designed beforehand. but the game cartridges themselves were limited to 4 kilobytes of ROM in those early days, making it infeasible, if not outright impossible, for the programmer of Entombed to have stored entire maze layouts statically, or to have such layouts residing in memory. Thus, it had to be generated procedurally, but that didn't quite seem right either. It wasn't purely random. The mazes almost always yielded valid paths, regardless of how long they went on for, and while a more modern system could easily evaluate the solvability of a maze in real time, such a feat was a bit outside the console's capabilities. The 2600 was, to put it diplomatically, anemic, even for its own time. Its budget MOS 6507 microprocessor limited its address space to 8 kilobytes, and programmers had to make do with a whopping 128 bytes of RAM on a weird agglomerate integrated circuit called a riot chip. Not small enough to be stored, not quick enough to be built. An impossible, inexplicable maze algorithm, and one that for a long time remained a mystery. That was until 2018, when researchers John Aycock and Tara Copplestone set out to disassemble the bytecode of Entombed to find out what exactly made it tick. And they found it. Sorta. After the laborious effort of reconstructing the game's source code, Aycock and Copplestone were able to deduce that, baked into the circuits of the Entombed cartridge, there was in fact a procedural maze generation algorithm. But why it worked wasn't quite so clear. Let me explain. Entombed generated squares of the maze in rows from top to bottom, and in each row left to right, like reading a book. To determine whether or not any given square would contain a space or a wall, the algorithm took 5 variables in the form of the 5 squares surrounding the square being generated. 2 to the left, 1 to the left, top middle, and top right. Since we're dealing with squares that can be either a space or a wall, we have essentially 5 binary digits. An unsigned 5-bit number, or a sample space of 32 possible wall configurations. After reading these digits, Entombed used them to query a lookup table on the cartridge, and this is the weird part. The table, seemingly arbitrarily, had 32 entries, one for each possible wall configuration, and based on the entries the game would place a wall, a space, or randomly select between the two, then move on to the next square. If we call the 5 input squares A through E in order, then input space wall would produce a space, wall space would produce a wall, and wall space would produce a random choice between the two, and so on like this for 29 more times. There was a case like this for every one of the 32 possible arrangements, and that's basically it. That's the algorithm. Now, this answers some questions and poses a couple more. It solves the problem of how the maze fits on the Entombed cartridge, and how it's able to be made so quickly. Since the game's only checking 5 squares at a time, it can generate the maze at the breakneck pace seen in-game. But the algorithm doesn't know anything about the maze. All it knows is the 5 squares surrounding its present index, and yet it's somehow able to procedurally create a consistently runnable maze each and every time. That'd be like only being able to see in a 2-foot circle around you and still being able to construct a 3-bedroom house at a normal pace. The table works, the algorithm works, the game works, but why? Aycock and Copplestone left this, for the time being, as an open question. But in time, contact was made with the only individual potentially able to answer it, the game's original programmer. As it would turn out, a man named Stephen Sidley was responsible for the game's creation in 1982. Aycock was able to make contact with Sidley and inquired as to the provenance of the algorithm, as well as how its seemingly miraculous table operated. But Sidley's response was not as expected. He had not written the algorithm. While working for US Games, the programmer had apparently been given a cartridge containing a mysterious maze generator algorithm by the company, and told to repurpose it into a functional game. Sidley then designed the game without fully understanding the algorithm either, simply using it to generate new rows and constructing a game around it. Steve Sidley programmed Entombed, but the algorithm predated it. When asked about the origins of the algorithm, Sidley was less helpful. He responded with a legend. that it had been written by, quote, a stoner who had developed it while blackout drunk and had no more understanding of its operation than anyone else. However, in closing, he did provide something slightly more useful: a name, Newell. Aycock was able to use this lead to unearth a 2008 interview by Digit Press with a computer scientist named Paul Allen Newell, in which he explains his experiences in the early 1980s creating a very familiar maze generation algorithm. After this article was discovered, and later following a New Yorker interview with Aycock, Sidley, and Newell in 2021, the story began to slowly piece itself together. You see, in 1981, Newell, a computer scientist working for Western Technologies, got it into his head to develop a game based upon navigating a dynamically generated maze. In collaboration with a mathematician friend named Duncan Muirhead, the pair developed a rough outline for an elegant algorithm to do exactly this over a few beers on a night out. Not quite the drunken stupor Sidley had described the session as, but hey, that's just how legends work. Newell had originally embarked on the creation of the algorithm during the development of a game called Towering Inferno, but had largely relegated it to a side project called MAZ-V by the spring of 1982. By the summer, while still working as a contractor, Newell's management had taken an interest in the maze program and requested that it be developed into a full-fledged game. As such, Newell handed over a stripped-down version of the algorithm called Minotaur 7 to a young programmer named Stephen Sidley, who constructed around it the game that would eventually become Entombed by the end of that year. And so the story concluded. A programmer and a mathematician write a hobbyist maze generator algorithm. An algorithm gets handed to a new programmer with little explanation. A programmer builds a working game around an algorithm, and the game goes unexplained for the next 35 years. In 2022, Aycock published a follow-up paper explaining how the drunken programmer story likely came about, that it was a way to defer intellectual property responsibility for ownership of the program, and in the paper gave it an official name, the Muirhead-Newell Endless Maze algorithm, reportedly named as such because Newell believed Muirhead's math had been 51% of the total work. Now, we're not quite done. We know where the algorithm came from, who wrote it, and how it ended up in Entombed, but we still don't know why it works. What's the deal with the table? How do the mazes come out the way they do when only a tiny chunk of the maze is visible to the algorithm? In 2021, two researchers at PSL in Paris named Leon Macleod and David Nakash posited that the table was tuned by its original programmer so that every choice conformed to a set of 3 rules: that 2x2 squares of wall or space weren't allowed, that any vertical chunk of wall or space couldn't start with width 1, and that any path in a line must connect to a path in the next line. When, based on the 5 input squares, a wall would violate any of these rules, a space is hard-coded to appear. Vice versa for walls, and when neither would violate a rule, a choice is randomly made. By this interpretation, Newell and Muirhead would have started with guidelines that ensure any given maze is solvable, then built a table of 32 entries where every entry is tuned to make sure it never breaks a rule, then finally written the algorithm to take input and place a square based on the table's output. But as it would turn out, all this wasn't necessary. For the 2022 paper, Aycock was able to obtain Newell's original notes for the algorithm and determine the exact steps the program took to determine a square's status. And, well, okay, this isn't a technical show, at least I don't try to make it one, so suffice to say the algorithm split the 5-square piece into 3 separate pieces and did some math with the first 2 pieces to determine what a square should be, with a special overriding case being selected if the 3rd piece was uniform, and 2 even more special cases being selected for specific arrangements that Newell noticed made unpleasant mazes in testing. So at the end of the day, the table was mostly an intermediary step and wasn't really the mystically effective codex that it was originally assumed to be, but I digress. It's kind of weird to know that it is indeed possible to write a piece of code so inexplicable that it becomes the subject of academic study years later. It makes me kind of paranoid, but that's just me. So ends the mystery of the Entombed maze algorithm, which, if you look at it a certain way, was never really a mystery at all. It just took a while to find the guy who had all the answers and was ready to give them. It makes you wonder, but
Anyway, that's all I got for tonight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around. Hey everybody. So last episode we talked about the bizarre maze generation algorithm from Entombed. Algorithms and protocols these days govern a lot of what we see and think and do, as has been the case since the beginning of the information age and a bit before it. Computers need protocols. A machine getting a big stream of bytes has absolutely no way of telling what any of it actually means, so it's up to computer scientists to build a system that makes things make sense. Take, for example, the internet. When people say the internet, they very often aren't actually referring to the internet, at least not explicitly. The internet is a bunch of computers scattered across the breadth of the earth and the lines of contact crisscrossing between them. But when you hear the internet mentioned, it's probably not in reference to this, but rather the collection of documents, videos, images, and other such resources stored within these computers and accessible through your web browser of choice. That is to say, the World Wide Web. The web is something so sprawling, so ubiquitous, so commanding in its presence, that it's easy to assume it simply has always been, intrinsically bound to the machines whose shells it inhabits. But that's not true at all. The web is yet another construct defined by a protocol, in this particular case, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And if things had been just a little different in the tumultuous, dawning days of the consumer global network, we might not have had it today at all. We might have, instead, been using something called Gopher. Now, before we get moving, let's make sure we understand exactly how the web works. At risk of grossly oversimplifying, the web and the HTTP derivatives it operates upon are basically just a way for computers to ask for things and get them. In its simplest form, one client machine within a network sends a formatted request for a file to a server machine in that same network, which is running a web server process that accepts the request, thinks it over for a bit, and either sends that file back, chopped into tiny pieces usually, or responds explaining why it can't do that. It's just asking for documents. It's always just been asking for documents. Of course, these days you've got asynchronous requests and differing transport protocols and encryption and so on and so forth. But the ironclad foundation upon which this spire of systems was built is just the idea that one computer can ask for a file and another computer can serve it up hot and ready. It's not exactly an obtuse concept, and really the only reason it took until 1990 and 1991 for computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee and his team to formally design a specification for it was simply because the internet just wasn't complex enough yet to necessitate it. And bearing this in mind, it should come as no great surprise that while the HTTP web team was plugging along at CERN in Switzerland, another parallel project was well underway at Minneapolis and St. Paul's own University of Minnesota, the powerful new Gopher protocol. Gopher's story begins, roughly, in 1991, when a U of M committee resolved to call for the creation of a campus-wide information system, or CWIS, for quick access of university resources. Colleges had long been years ahead of the world at large when it came to the testing of networking concepts, and internet overlay information retrieval systems were no great exception. The university wanted, in essence, a custom-built system through which its computers could query each other to quickly and efficiently fetch files without the use of the beast that was FTP. After a great deal of deliberation, design of the system fell to a small university development team sourced from the school's microcomputer center and led by one Mark P. McCahill. And throughout '91, the group put in hours on what would, by the middle of the year, be officially known as the Gopher Internet Protocol.
a play on both the university's mascot and the colloquial use of the term for someone who goes for something. You get it. The protocol's original presentation to the College Board, according to team member Bob Alberti, was an unmitigated disaster, as the Gopher Group had designed the protocol to operate over a client-server architecture instead of running off a mainframe as the administration had requested, and the university subsequently refused to see the project carried any further. Undeterred, developer Paul Lindner unleashed Gopher upon the Virgin net at large in the hopes that the system could thrive on its own in April of 1991. And if one were to get their hands on an early version of the software upon such a spring morning, this is what they'd come face to face with. Gopher was, by design, simple and almost painfully direct. Structurally, it wasn't too far off from the web of tomorrow. One computer could run a Gopher server whilst another ran a Gopher client. The client could ask the server for whatever it so desired, so on and so forth. But that was about where the similarities ended. A sample Gopher session would go like this. The client opens a TCP connection with the server on a pre-decided Gopher port. This is how they say hi. The client sends an empty line, indicating that it's ready to accept information, and the server sends back a Gopher directory listing. This is where Gopher really stands on its own. The system was structured and hierarchical, with any given Gopher server consisting of a tree of directories that narrow down further and further in specificity until you get access to the specific document or file that you seek. Its type, of course, indicated by a simple plaintext enumerator value at the beginning of its directory listing. For example, since I think one honestly might be needed, if I opened up my Gopher browser and connected to my favorite Gopher server in search of my favorite photos of cool arches and columns, I'd click through to the directory for pictures, then click through to the directory for architectural photos, and finally be served a listing of photos for me to download. Each listing in a Gopher directory represented either a file or another directory, and served up alongside the listings and their types was a resource locator string that the Gopher client could send to another server in order to get access to whatever it was meant to locate. As something of an effect of how the internet worked at that point, and unlike the strictly regimented URLs of today, these locators didn't really have to conform to any standard at all. They simply instructed the Gopher browser to send this specific message to this specific server with the promise of being rewarded with whatever the directory said it held. Servers could also direct clients to other servers entirely, if needed. And that, in essence, was Gopher. And the people loved it. It's hard to describe the exact manner in which Gopher propagated across the net, because at the time, it really wasn't comparable to anything that had occurred in the preceding years. The protocol found overnight strongholds in universities across the nation, who accepted the system with open arms and reached out with eagerness for the next updates and additions to be added. It's important to note that at this point, we're still riding the edge of the internet's incubation period, so it just wasn't feasible for the meager 5 million global internet users, consisting mostly of students, researchers, and hobbyists, to send Gopher up the top of the charts in the way the future internet would be capable of. But let it be known that they damn well did their best. Within weeks, letters were being written into the University of Minnesota demanding new functionality and future versions, and with this the team was reinstated and instructed to work on the development of the official Gopher software package by the beginning of 1991. And so, as the net began to expand at a dizzying pace that shocked even its own long-term denizens and overseers, so did Gopher and its influence begin to spread with it. By 1992, as relayed by the team in years to come, hundreds of working Gopher servers had sprung up across the continental US, and more with each passing day, abroad as well. This was the great transitional period of the internet, from an epoch that had begun when ARPANET was first switched on in 1969, into one that we arguably still reside within to this very day. No longer was the net relegated to college campuses and sequestered within squat laboratory buildings. Everyday people were, for the first time, getting an introduction to this fascinating new technology. And by 1992, chances are their first encounter featured a conversation with the Gopher server. The infrastructure and community soon began to catch up with the excitement as well. November 92 saw a team from Reno's University of Nevada publish the first version of Veronica, a full-feature Gopher search engine with possibly the most egregious backronym for a name I have ever had the pleasure of coming across. Naming aside, Veronica was a trailblazing piece of software and one of the most sophisticated search engines in existence at the time of its creation. 3 months earlier, the first of many Gopher cons had taken place in sunny Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the following 4 cons over the following 4 years would prove instrumental in strengthening the community and bringing about changes in the product's development. These cons were some of the first major enthusiast gatherings centered around an internet tech community. They drew crowds of not just hobbyists, but interested university representatives, scientists, and big-shot corporate investors. Developers introduced their own Gopher-centric passion projects. They had their own t-shirts. Al Gore was there. It was like nothing seen before. Browsing the internet's sprawling, decentralized library of extant resources was now, for the very first time, made organic and slick and accessible. And it seemed that more so now than ever, any new idea released upon the net at large would make its debut on a Gopher server, including, as the story goes, a strange new information system protocol out of CERN called the World Wide Web. But we'll get back to that later. In 1993, Gopher's dominion over the net was, in a sense, codified when IANA officially designated the prestigious TCP port 70 as the reserved Gopher communication channel, which it continues to hold to this day, closer to ground level than the bastions of HTTP and HTTPS on ports 80 and 443, respectively. By this point in time, it was estimated that close to 7,000 Gopher servers were actively maintained across the globe, far greater in number than any competing standard, and attaining a record high of roughly 1 Gopher server for every 1,400 internet users. In just 2 short years, it had gotten to a point where, to a great number of internet users, it was Gopher or nothing. There simply couldn't be another way to feasibly surf the global network. But of course, as you all know, and at the risk of belaboring the point, this was not to last. In matters of history, when grappling with rise and fall narratives, don't ever let anybody tell you that it was just that one thing. That eternal perpetuation was all but inevitable, if not for one key moment that forced a sudden, painful disintegration. With the dance of Gopher and the web, it's easy to mythologize what would occur as a face-to-face struggle with a single champion and a conquered foe, to say that the web was just too good, just too strong for Gopher to stand beneath the weight of its growing shadow. But that's not entirely true, is it? In reality, as is overwhelmingly often the case, Gopher's slow collapse can be attributed to a number of different factors, all on their own a bit mundane, but as a collective, I think a hell of a lot more interesting. 2 events in this category occurred which quickly shifted the dynamics of Gopher use online. Firstly, at GopherCon 93, which took place in April in Minneapolis, University of Michigan announced it would begin charging a licensing fee for all future editions of the software package published by the Gopher team. As it would turn out, since Gopher Server had been available as freeware for the past 2 years, the Gopher team had remained largely internally funded throughout development, and the university had made the choice to cash in on the popularity of their proprietary technology. In a turn of events which shocked precisely no one, the community's reaction was swift and invariably negative, flooding Gopher space with outrage and turning many off the project entirely. This was not made any better when, in mid-1993, the team posted an inflammatory public address to all Gopher users attempting to justify the imposition of fees. The move, which famously did not work for Bill Gates in '76, flopped comparably for the Gopher team in '93, and as Bob Alberti would put it, socially killed Gopher.
At the same time, and a few states away, the University of Illinois' NCSA lab announced the initial public release of Mosaic, developed by many of the same researchers who would go on to design Netscape Navigator, and widely considered the first commercially successful internet browser. Mosaic offered a bevy of versatile browsing features in a markedly user-friendly graphical package, and, it should be noted, was built to browse the burgeoning World Wide Web, not the extant Gopher space. But these factors alone did not kill Gopher. Far from it. What they did do, however, was create an environment in which Gopher was newly pricey and stained with controversy, whilst the comparatively newer web was unblemished, distinguished by the shine of youth and boasting support from the world's first browser to make front-page news. Throughout 1993, Gopher traffic increased by a factor of 10, but for the first time, the growth of the net, and now the World Wide Web, was outpacing it. These changes paved the way for the second category of factors to take effect, slower in pace but utterly inexorable. Simply put, the internet had changed. Gopher, with its strict form and hierarchy, simple communication protocols, and fully list-based navigation, had found its niche in text-based browsers, campus information systems, and the pre-1993 hobbyist internet. But the web, with its largely form-agnostic nature and free-form linking system in the form of clickable hypertext, seemed with each day ever more suited to the sprawling, disjointed, and endlessly diverse internet of the oncoming 21st century. For the very first time in 1994, the number of web users would surpass that of Gopher, and within another year or two, it was no longer a contest. To quote directly from the Gopher team's youngest developer, Paul Lindner, in an interview with Minnesota Post in 2016, "I remember the exact moment I knew I was no longer on the right track. It was September 9th, 1993. I was invited to give a talk about Gopher at Princeton, and I had my slides all printed up on my little university budget black and white foils. The person presenting before me was talking about the future of the web, with full-color LCD projection, and I said, I think I see where things are going." But you can't kill a protocol. It doesn't work like that. There are people alive today who still use Telnet. Gopher didn't die, it just went a bit underground, where it continued to persist throughout Y2K and the onset of the 21st century. These days, the original Gopher team is all but moved on from the project, and its modern-day care and feeding is now largely carried out by a California-based man named Cameron Kaiser, owner of Floodgap Systems, whose Gopher server at gopher.floodgap.com now acts as the largest load-bearing junction point in the entirety of Gopher space. Floodgap offers an online Gopher proxy and maintains the Overbyte project, an initiative to regularly release and update modern-day Gopher client and server software that's compatible with contemporary systems. Kaiser has gone on record saying that he believes the web has wandered astray in recent years in terms of overhead, clutter, and bandwidth requirements, and if you use it for any length of time in the present day, you might find yourself agreeing with him. He argues that despite lacking many of the quality of life features and versatility the web has come to possess, Gopher is still entirely viable for many avenues of net surfing and is even superior in certain regards. And if you want to give Gopher a shot, it's honestly not that difficult. A good deal of non-mainline browsers support it, and there's even a handful of up-to-date dedicated browsers that deal in nothing but Gopher. During research for this video, I used links because I'm a dork, but you don't have to do that, and the resources offered by Floodgap make the process of onboarding almost entirely painless. The whole thing, for whatever it's worth, gets my endorsement. I say, try it out. The story of Gopher isn't a story of competition, of wasted potential or ruinous downfalls. It's just another chapter in the still ongoing narrative of the internet, and, if you will, a reminder that just because something seems like it's always been and forever will be, doesn't mean that's truly the case. I think these days, that's something kind of important to remember. Thanks for watching, everybody, and have a good night.
finally. Honey, what are you sewing on the computer? Dinner's ready. Honey, what? Are you looking at porn? Porn on the family computer?
Mom, I don't know what's happening.
Honey, go to the kitchen right now. You're in deep trouble, young man.
No, I'm not gonna porn on the computer.
Hey everybody. It's the last episode of the season. As such, I don't think a segue is fully needed. Instead, I'll simply ask, did you know that the United States is currently under a state of emergency? Okay, I'm being slightly dishonest. We're actually under around 40 at the present moment. The oldest was signed into effect by Jimmy Carter with the issuance of Executive Order 12170 all the way back in 1979, and over the subsequent decades, states of emergency have simply been put into effect faster than they've been formally called off. Each currently in effect represents a, theoretically temporary, expansion of federal capability, and each manifests this expansion in its own unique way. But of particular value to our story tonight is one Proclamation 7463, issued by then-President George W. Bush on September the 14th of 2001.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Although not widely known at the time, this declaration was the first of several steps which ground into frightening motion a soon unstoppable series of legislative shifts that were, in a sense, the first real federal actions to harness and leverage the wild, untamed power of the information age. Over the following years, a shadowed Leviathan emboldened by nearly unbounded executive power would rouse far beneath the waking eyes of the American populace and would, in time, come to work its writhing tendrils into nearly all sectors of public life, unseen in its grotesque enormity. And beneath notice it would remain until, one day in early 2003, it was discovered, unassuming and unobtrusive, on the 6th floor of the at&t building at 611 Folsom Street in San Francisco, behind a door labeled 641A. Mark L. Klein was born into a Brooklyn, New York family on May 2nd of 1945, just 6 days before silence fell on the European front of the Second World War. Klein pursued a bachelor's in history at Cornell University and graduated in 1966 before attending technical school and finding employment in computer manufacturing throughout the 1960s and 70s. He participated in protest marches against the war in Vietnam and witnessed the revelation of a widespread domestic espionage campaign under the Nixon administration in the late 1970s. Klein had lived through close to 40 years of American political turmoil before discovering what would be his lifetime career in November of 1981, when he secured a position as a communications technician working for the at&t Corporation on the cusp of the Bell system divestiture. The pace of these revelations would not slow at any point during his 22-year tenure with the company, as he was transferred from New York City to White Plains in 1990, to Pleasanton, California in 91, Point Reyes in 93, and finally to at&t's Geary Street facility in San Francisco in January of 1998. And it was during his time at this particular location that an event would occur which, to Klein at least, eclipsed all that preceded it in the scale of its impact. It's impossible to overstate the degree to which the attacks of September 11th, 2001 fundamentally altered the United States. There was really nothing in living memory at the time which could compare. In a sense, the events leading up to that day and the immediate, cataclysmic backlash are a Rosetta Stone to understanding much of the next 25 years of American politics. I could go on for this entire video and 10 more on this topic alone, but of import to the matter at hand is the federal government's sweeping legislative response.
The United States of America is an enemy of those who aid terrorists.
It was a recognition that we were facing a new day.
They said, quote, the full resources of the United States government will be brought to bear to protect the American people.
Spearheaded by the Bush administration, which for that brief period saw its approval rating skyrocket from a middling +12 net to a historic +84, the American political apparatus issued a broadside of legislation which utterly obliterated any extant limitations on its own power, in the name, of course, of fighting terrorism both abroad and at home. The following days, months, and years saw the declaration of 2 states of emergency, the initiation of DARPA's Total Information Awareness Program, the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, and of course, the crown jewel of post-9/11 legislation, this name is so fucking stupid, the USA Patriot Act of 2001. As a collective, these various acts essentially gave the federal government free rein to act and acquire information with impunity on all matters pertaining to counterterrorism and national security, a set of definitions which would prove remarkably flexible in the coming years. Mark Klein, at this point in his late 50s, was working as a computer network associate in a San Francisco AT&T office when these changes took effect. Klein was aware of the upheavals in Washington, but remained physically disconnected from them until one summer day in 2002, he received an email. A manager at the San Francisco office had issued a notice that a representative from the National Security Agency would be stopping by to conduct some unspecified business. This struck Klein as strange. He would recall, in recounting the event in an interview with PBS Frontline, the passing of the FISA Act of 1978, enacted in the aftermath of the Nixon-era domestic surveillance scandal, which mandated federal law enforcement to obtain explicit authorization before conducting intelligence gathering on domestic soil. Nevertheless, strange as it may have been, Klein directed the apparently highly subdued representative, when he did arrive, to the appropriate figures, and as the days wore on, thought increasingly little of it. However, in the fall of that year, rumors began to circulate. Whispers began to slip through the brickwork of Klein's Geary Street workplace that the man in black had not vanished after his brief exchange with Klein's supervisor, and that he was in fact keeping in close contact with a project being undertaken at the nearby Folsom Street location, an AT&T phone line and internet hub facility. A low level of anxiety concerning this nondescript project simmered around the office, and for good reason. The news at this precise point in '02 was awash with stories of DARPA's Total Information Awareness Program, an initiative led by one Admiral John M. Poindexter, to collate various swaths of government data into a massive standardized database, documenting, in neat, query-ready form, the lives of each and every individual currently living on US soil. To Klein and his colleagues, a line between the program, or another like it, and the happenings at the Folsom Street office seemed all too easy to draw. And it was around this time that Klein first heard word of a strange room being built on the 6th floor of the compound. Things escalated in January 2003, when Klein and 3 technician colleagues were invited to Folsom Street to take a tour of the location in preparation for being transferred. And it was on this tour that Klein caught his first glimpse of the mysterious room the NSA agent had frequented. The 24x48 chamber was nothing noteworthy from the outside, and any contents of note were hidden behind a nondescript, single-wide orange door labeled plainly with the room's number, 641A. This visit only piqued Klein's curiosity. Room 641A, he would soon find out, was off-limits to all technicians employed in the building, in direct violation of union rules, accessible only to a single management field specialist with security clearance. The room was also, strangely, built adjacent to Folsom Street's primary phone switch room, through which thousands of calls were routed daily. But it wouldn't be until October of 2003, when Klein was officially relocated to the new office, that the nature of room 641A would become apparent. Klein was subject to oversight from a longtime employee of Folsom Street, whom he would soon be replacing, for his first 2 months as a technician in the 7th floor internet relay room, which handled large chunks of traffic over AT&T's WorldNet service. Out of curiosity, during one of their long collaborative shifts, Klein broached the topic of the bizarre room on the floor beneath them. "Well, it seems to me," Klein remarked, "that the secret room is right next to the phone switch room, so I assume they're listening to phone calls." Instantly, the senior technician had a response. "No," he said. "Internet. Here, I'll show you." Klein was led past row upon row of humming networking equipment until he arrived at a seemingly innocuous cabinet, wired into the room's fiber optic lines and containing a piece of technology very strange indeed. An optical splitter, designed to duplicate incoming optical data and send the copy elsewhere without damaging the original signal. And the copies, in this case, were taking a one-way superhighway trip directly down into the inscrutable depths of 641A. This was, in technical terms, really scary, when considered in conjunction with the services Folsom Street provided. WorldNet was the primary service offered by AT&T at that point in time in its capacity as an ISP, and Folsom Street just so happened to be a link along WorldNet's common backbone, through which, essentially, all of the service's traffic flowed at one point or another. Not only this, but the facility also contained peering links, which allowed intercommunication between AT&T's network and the networks of other Tier 1 ISPs, passing through massive load-bearing internet exchange points like May West, and permitting traffic from period networks like Quest to flow through Folsom Street as well if needed. In other words, whatever was down there in 641A, it was getting everything. By this point, Klein had begun searching for hard evidence to substantiate his suspicions. He dug up internal documents dating to the end of 2002 and the beginning of 2003, which described procedures for technicians to install the splitter cabinets, protocols for cutting into 16 of Folsom Street's peering links, and routing their traffic through the splitters to 641A, which the documents plainly referred to as the Study Group 3 Secure Room. To Klein, the smoking gun, if one was to exist, came in the form of an equipment registry for the SG3 Secure Room, dated back to December of 2002. The document, which itemized the networking machinery contained within 641A, featured the strange inclusion, on its 16th line, of a device called a Neris STA6400. Klein, by that point a 2-decade networking veteran, had never once come across the device or its manufacturer, raising a red flag which was immediately set alight when he discovered the device to be an internet traffic analysis engine developed by a big tech analytics firm which specialized in intelligence gathering. To sum up, inside room 641A was a spy machine overseen by an NSA agent with direct, unfiltered access to the lion's share of American internet traffic circa late 2003. Based upon references to other sites present in the internal documents, as well as conversations with involved technicians, Klein additionally came to suspect that rooms similar to 641A were present all across the continental US. Astute viewers amongst you may have identified this as a bit of a problem, as did Klein. Taking photocopies of the relevant papers, Klein retired from his position at AT&T in May 2004, and, following the publication of a New York Times piece in December 2005 on recently discovered domestic wiretapping and the Bush admin's aggressive response, he felt the time had come and brought his story to the Electronic Frontier Foundation in the hopes of bringing unprecedented litigation to bear against the federal government. And in January of 2006, the EFF officially filed what would become Hepting v. AT&T. From here, things moved very quickly. Hepting was introduced January 31st, and, it should be noted, was at this point filed only against the AT&T Corporation, not the NSA. In the suit, the EFF alleged that AT&T's conduct was in direct violation of FISA, the gospel for domestic surveillance legislation, and sought an injunction against the telecom giant requiring them to compensate each and every customer that may have been harmed by the Study Group 3 operations. On April 28th, AT&T moved to dismiss the case, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, on May 13th, the United States government moved to intervene as a defendant, essentially entering the case aligned with AT&T, similarly moving to dismiss the case in its entirety. The Justice Department attempted to invoke state secrets privilege, a precedent dating back to 1876 that allows the federal government to outright block the presentation of evidence if said evidence would lead to the revelation of government secrets, which in this particular case would obstruct the viewing of Klein's documents and testimony. On July 20th, however, California District Court Judge Vaughn Walker denied both AT&T and the United States their motions to dismiss, ruling that a company could not assert immunity, and the case continued. Escalating, the defendants appealed the case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals by 2007 and were approved. By this point, media outlets, including the Seattle Times and the Wall Street Journal, had begun to report on the case, and the jury first began to hear argument in August. And then, in July of 2008, it all stopped. In August, the Ninth Circuit Court remanded the case back to the California District Court. The United States moved to dismiss in September, and on June 3rd of 2009, the District Court granted this motion, judging in favor of AT&T Corporation and the United States of America. What the fuck happened? Well, as it would turn out, while Hepting v. AT&T was making its way through the court system, a resolution numbered 6304 was introduced on the House floor by Texas Representative Sylvester Reyes, which soared through the House and Senate and onto the desk of the president, being promptly signed into law on July 10th of 2008 as the FISA Amendments Act. The act granted, alongside other broad privileges, sweeping retroactive immunity for commercial entities like AT&T from investigation and prosecution. The original FISA Act of 1978, which Klein had seen introduced in direct response to the premier wiretapping scandal of the 20th century, in an instant saw any teeth it might have had blunted beyond use in service to the perpetuation of a new century's surveillance monolith. It was in recognition of this development that the case, along with all hopes which may have been riding on it, was dropped without ceremony. The involvement of foul play was painfully, blindingly obvious, a 10,000-ton elephant wedged into a tiny AT&T server room. But how can you litigate something that's been retroactively made legal? Now, of course, the fight did not end here. The EFF remained a staunch supporter of cases which followed in Hepting's footsteps, as did Klein, until his death just this year, at the age of 79. And there have, to be fair, been sporadic breaks in the greater case, like the Snowden leaks in 2013. But by and large, the trend has been one of steady growth for the programs and operations born in the sultry, primordial dawning hours of the digital millennium. total information awareness and the terrorist surveillance program became PRISM, and everything else made legal under Section 702 of the 2008 FISA Act. And these programs undoubtedly continue not just to operate, but to flourish to this very day. And the thing about it is, stuff like this isn't perpetuated through negligence. This type of legislation is required to be regularly extended and renewed and expanded over the years, and with very few exceptions, it is. That Bush-era state of emergency from September 14th, 2001 was ordered to continue by Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump again. The RISA Act of 2024 not only renewed the 2008 FISA Act, but expanded its scope even further. In the time since Mark Klein broke the 641A story, there have been brief incendiary moments where the curtain was ripped aside for a fleeting instant. But there exists no doubt in my mind that the apparatus of surveillance has only grown more encompassing. The Leviathan sunk deeper and yet ever more pervasive. Will there arrive, with the oncoming future, a day when this is no longer the case? I sure as hell hope so, but until such a day arrives, the best I can offer is stay safe out there. And for the last time in this season, since we started back in 2023, thanks for watching. See you in season 3, I suppose.